In a crumbling of the city, where shattered neon lights flickered over cracked corner sidewalks, a quiet, warm-hearted black waitress spent her days quietly caring for those around her. One freezing night, she unexpectedly came across an older man who had been beaten and robbed. Without hesitation, she brought him back to her diner, offering him a hot meal and a warm place to rest. What she didn't know was that he was a city councilman, and when he returned, her life would change forever. The night draped itself heavily over the forgotten corner of the city, where broken streetlights buzzed and flickered, casting sickly pools of yellow over cracked sidewalks. Storefronts sat shuttered and empty, their windows boarded up with old plywood that groaned in the cold wind. Trash stirred along the curbs like restless spirits, and the sharp smell of damp concrete and exhaust clung to the air. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional distant hum of a car speeding through somewhere safer, somewhere richer. It was a part of the city people pretended didn't exist after sundown, a place where the cold bit deeper and time seemed to stand still. Through this muted, wounded landscape walked Elise Johnson, her steps brisk against the cold that tried to creep through her thin coat. She pulled her scarf higher over her mouth, her breath rising in faint white clouds. The weight of the day still clung to her shoulders. The long hours on her feet at the diner, the tight smiles to customers who barely looked her way, the constant calculation of how to stretch tips into rent, groceries, and maybe a little more gas in the car that barely ran. She was used to moving through the world this way, alert but unseen, practical but dreaming just enough to stay alive. Her eyes, sharp and familiar with the neighborhood's dangers, swept the empty street ahead of her. The old brick buildings leaned tiredly against one another. Somewhere down an alley, a bottle crashed to the ground, followed by angry shouts. Elise didn't flinch. This was the song of her world, and she had learned long ago to walk steady and keep her head high, no matter what whispered in the shadows. Then she saw him, a man crumpled near the sidewalk's edge, his figure almost swallowed by the gloom. He was older, his body hunched, clothes torn and filthy, as if he'd been caught in a storm and left to dry under the city's cruel indifference. For a split second, Elise hesitated. In places like this, stopping could be a risk. But something deeper than fear moved her feet forward. Something her mother once told her long ago. "We don't walk past hurt if we can help it, baby." Drawing closer, she saw the way the man's hands shook as he tried and failed to push himself upright. A battered wallet lay open on the ground a few feet away, its contents gone, a mocking testament to the city's hunger. His face, half hidden beneath a dirty knit cap, turned slightly away as if trying to make himself invisible. Elise crouched down beside him, her voice low and steady against the whistling wind. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked, already knowing the answer. There was no one else out here, no one who would stop, no one who would see him but her. The man gave a weak shake of his head, his pride warring with his pain. Elise didn't press him. She simply offered her hand, firm and open. After a beat of uncertainty, he took it, his fingers cold and rough against her own. She pulled him carefully to his feet, steadying his weight with a strength that belied her small frame. "Come on," she said, half coaxing, half commanding. "You're not staying out here tonight." In the dim, flickering light of the street, Elise Johnson, 26 years old, diner waitress, survivor of 100 small battles no one ever saw, wrapped her arm around a stranger's shoulders and led him forward into the night, toward the only warmth she could offer. The diner wasn't much to look at in the dead of night, a squat brick building with a crooked neon sign that buzzed weakly against the darkness, but to Elise it was the closest thing she had to a second home. She unlocked the door with a practiced flick of her wrist, nudging it open with her hip as she guided the man inside. The warm, stale air hit them both immediately, carrying the mingled scents of burnt coffee, frying oil, and worn leather from the cracked booths. Elise moved quickly, flicking on just enough lights to chase away the shadows without making the place feel exposed. She led him to a booth tucked away in the corner, one she always kept ready with an extra blanket folded neatly under the seat for nights just like this. The man slid into the booth stiffly, his movements slow and careful, his face tense as if each small action risked something precious breaking inside him. He sat hunched, his hands knotted together on the table, knuckles pale with strain. His gaze stayed low, fixed on the chipped surface of the table as though afraid to meet the world straight on. Shame radiated off him in brittle waves, an invisible armor worn thin from too many battles lost. Lise recognized that weight. The way it clung, the way it hollowed a man out from the inside, and it stirred something fierce and tender in her chest. Without speaking, she offered a small, warm smile before slipping behind the counter. Her movements were efficient but careful, like someone handling something fragile. She pulled open the fridge, searching for what little she could give: a pot of leftover stew, still good, a half loaf of bread, and a slice of pie she had been saving, but now gave away without a second thought. As she worked, she kept him in the corner of her eye and saw how rigid he remained, how he glanced once toward the door, as if debating whether he should bolt and spare himself the humiliation, then dropped his gaze back down, shoulders sagging in defeat. When the food was ready, she carried it over and placed it gently in front of him. For a moment he just stared at it, his hand hovering over the spoon but not moving. His throat worked in a tight, painful swallow, and Elise caught a glimpse of glassy eyes hastily blinked clear. He muttered a thank you, so hoarse it barely stirred the air between them. She answered with only a quiet nod, as if to say that gratitude wasn't required here. Knowing the silence between them threatened to thicken into something suffocating, Elise sat across from him, folding her hands around her coffee cup. She let a beat pass, just enough to make her presence feel easy, then spoke with a soft, even tone. "You're not the only one having a rough night," she said, her voice threading through the low hum of the diner. She tilted her head toward the worn counter. Last week, a boy about 16 wandered in, soaked through like a drowned kitten, hadn't eaten in 2 days. Gave him a meal, dried his clothes by the stove. He left a thank you note on a napkin, it's still taped up in the back. The man lifted his eyes just briefly, flickering with a mixture of surprise and cautious disbelief, before dropping them again as if afraid to hope too much. "And Mrs. Hendricks?" Elise continued, her voice laced with affection. She lost everything after her husband passed. "Comes by every Tuesday. I slip her a little care package when I can. She always brings me stories about her grandkids." She smiled, her face softening. "And Mr. Morales, old man down the street, trades me Spanish lessons for a slice of pie. Says I have a terrible accent, but I think he just likes the company." For the first time, a ghost of a smile flickered across the man's lips, small and fleeting, but there. Elise caught it and held it gently between them, an invisible bridge laid down over a river of silent hurt. Char shrugged and leaned in a little closer, lowering her voice as if confiding a secret. "Hard times don't pick favorites. Everyone's fighting something. You're not alone, sir. You're not broken. You're just human." Across from her, the man sat frozen for a moment, as if the words were sinking past years of hard-packed defenses. His fingers unclenched slightly on the table, his shoulders sagging, not in defeat this time, but in a small release of tension he hadn't even realized he was holding. A deep, trembling breath escaped him, and though he didn't speak, Elise saw it. The smallest flicker of warmth returning to his eyes, fragile as a candle in the wind, but alive nonetheless. "Jared." She rose after a moment, careful not to disrupt the fragile balance they had built. "Eat as much as you want," she said, her voice light again. "And when you're ready, there's a booth in the back with a blanket, not fancy, but it'll do the job tonight." Turning away to give him privacy, Elise busied herself behind the counter, wiping surfaces that didn't need cleaning, stacking plates that were already neat. She heard, faint but certain, the clink of a spoon tapping against the side of the bowl, and it brought a quiet satisfaction to her heart. Outside, the night still pressed hard against the windows, cold and indifferent, but inside this little pocket of warmth, hope had begun its slow, stubborn work. The hours stretched thin as the night deepened, folding the world outside into an even darker hush. Inside the diner, time slowed to a gentler rhythm, the ticking of the old clock above the counter marking each passing minute like a steady heartbeat. Elise moved quietly through the space, checking supplies, wiping down surfaces, tending to small tasks that didn't truly need doing but gave her a reason to stay nearby without crowding the man who had found a fragile piece at the corner booth. He ate slowly, spoonful by spoonful, with the kind of deliberate care that spoke more of exhaustion than hunger, as if every bite was a silent negotiation between gratitude and pride. From behind the counter, Elise kept watch in the way you do when you want to protect without making someone feel watched. She noticed how he relaxed by degrees, the stiffness in his shoulders easing, the guarded set of his mouth softening. His eyes, which earlier had darted around like a trapped animal's, now stayed settled on his bowl, steady and quiet. When he finished, he folded his hands neatly on the table, as if unsure what to do next, his gaze drifting toward the darkened windows where the city pressed close but for now could not touch him. Elise approached with slow, unhurried steps, carrying a clean towel and a cracked ceramic mug filled with hot water and a few lemon slices she had scavenged from the kitchen. She set them down gently, offering a nod instead of words, and gestured toward the back of the diner where a worn leather booth waited, a folded blanket and an old pillow already laid out. He hesitated only a moment before rising, moving stiffly toward the small refuge she had prepared. As he settled in, pulling the blanket around his shoulders, Elise turned away again, giving him the dignity of solitude. The night wore on, the diner growing cooler as the heating struggled against the relentless cold. Elise eventually curled up in another booth, arms folded beneath her head, half dozing but never fully asleep. Her mind drifted between dreams and memories, snatches of conversations and faces long gone, stitched together by a stubborn thread of hope she refused to let go. Across the room, the man slept fitfully, sometimes stirring, sometimes murmuring under his breath words she couldn't catch. And yet, somehow, the diner felt safer, fuller, like two lonely souls had managed to carve out a small sanctuary against the vast, empty night. When dawn began its slow, reluctant creep into the sky, painting the edges of the world with a bruised gray light, Elise stirred and sat up, stretching the stiffness from her limbs. She glanced toward the back booth, ready to greet him with a warm smile, ready to offer coffee and maybe an old jacket she kept in the back closet. But the booth was empty. The blanket, carefully folded, sat where he had lain, and the mug rested neatly on the table, cleaned as best as it could be with a napkin. There was no note, no name, no trace left behind except the faintest indentation in the cracked leather seat and the lingering warmth of presence. Elise stood there for a long moment, her heart tugged by an unexpected sadness. She had known better than to expect anything. No one owed her explanations, and kindness, when real, asked for nothing in return. Still, a small, foolish part of her had hoped to offer him more, to prove to herself that sometimes the world could stitch up its broken places if only given half a chance. She smiled to herself, a soft, private thing, and shook her head. She gathered the blanket and mug, moving with the steady, unhurried grace of someone who had long since learned that even small mercies matter. The city outside was waking up now, its endless noise and hunger stirring once again, and there were always more people who needed a hot meal, a warm booth, a place to belong, even if only for a night. Elise Johnson, standing alone in the quiet, worn-out diner, tightened the knot on her apron and got back to work. 3 days passed, each one blurring into the next with the steady sameness of early winter mornings and long, bone-tired shifts. Elise barely thought about the man after that first heavy ache of his absence had dulled. She told herself he was just another soul passing through, another story she would never fully know. The diner pulled her back into its orbit, customers needing refills, deliveries arriving late, the cash register jamming again. Life went on the way it always did, stubborn and relentless, but even as she moved through the small routines of her world, some part of her, quiet and watchful, kept glancing toward the door every time the bell above it jingled, a small pulse of hope she was too proud to admit even to herself. It was the end of a slow, gray afternoon when the door swung open, with more force than usual, the jangle of the bell sharp against the quiet. Elise looked up from where she was stacking menus, expecting another regular, another tired face, and instead froze. Her breath catching mid-motion, her hand stayed suspended in the air, the menu slipping slightly in her grip. It was him. Only it wasn't. The man she remembered had been hunched, battered, barely stitched together. The man who stood in the doorway now was tall, composed, dressed in a tailored coat that spoke of money and influence, his hair neatly combed, his bearing sure and steady. He didn't look like someone the city had tried to chew up. He looked like someone who had found a way to stand above it. He wasn't alone. 2 other men in crisp suits flanked him, one carrying a leather portfolio, the other sporting a city service badge pinned neatly to his lapel. Elise's mouth opened slightly, a rush of confusion and disbelief tightening in her chest. She set the menus down with trembling fingers, wiping suddenly sweaty palms on her apron. Every nerve in her body seemed to buzz with electricity as she watched him approach. The man stopped just in front of her, offering a smile that was steady but warm, his eyes searching hers like he was making sure she still recognized him, not for the clothes or the posture, but for the man underneath. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice richer and stronger than she remembered. "My name is William Hartman. I'm a councilman for this district, newly elected to oversee public outreach programs." For a heartbeat, Elise could only blink at him. Then the words tumbled out of her before she could stop them. "Wait, what? Councilman?" Her voice pitched slightly higher in pure, unguarded astonishment. She let out a breathless laugh, half disbelieving, half stunned. "You're telling me the man eating stew and shivering under my pie counter the other night is a councilman?" William chuckled, the sound low and a little sheepish. "I wasn't exactly in top form," he admitted. "Bad night, worse judgment. I just needed to clear my head. Ended up at the wrong fountain at the wrong time." William motioned toward one of his aides, who pulled a thick envelope from the portfolio. He held it out but didn't force it into her hands. "I'm hosting a public event tomorrow," he said, "a community forum. We're announcing an expansion to city resources for the homeless and vulnerable. And I want you there, Miss Johnson. I want people to know about the work that's already happening, the work you've been doing quietly, without recognition." Elise stared at the envelope like it might bite her. "Me?" she said again, voice cracking on the single word. She laughed once, short and breathless. "You must have got me confused with somebody else. I'm just a waitress who burns toast half the time and hands out leftovers when no one's looking." William's gaze didn't waver. "You're a lot more than that," he said. "You didn't ask who I was that night. You didn't care about titles or appearances. You saw someone hurting and you acted. That's the kind of leadership this city needs to see." Elise bit her lip, looking down at her hands calloused from years of work, hands that shook slightly now with the enormity of what he was asking. "I don't know," she mumbled, her voice thick. "I'm not like you, Councilman. I'm not polished. I'm not important." William leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You are important. You just don't see it because you're too busy holding everyone else up." He let the words hang there, heavy and real. "Come to the forum. Tell your story. Let them see what real kindness looks like." For a long, trembling moment, Elise stood caught in the middle of her doubt and something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride, thin and flickering but stubborn as a flame against the cold. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she reached out and took the envelope, feeling the weight of it settle into her palm like a new beginning. I'll think about it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. William smiled again, softer now, with a hint of something that looked almost like relief. "That's all I ask." With a respectful nod, he and his aides turned and left, the bell over the diner door jingling once more, a bright, hopeful sound that lingered long after they were gone. Elise stood there, staring at the door, the envelope clutched to her chest, her heart hammering like a drumbeat in her ears. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure if her life was about to change, but for once, she dared to hope that maybe it could. The next day dawned cold and brittle, a thin crust of frost glazing the sidewalks and the breath of the city rising in small, ghostly puffs with every passing car. Elise stood in front of the mirror tucked into the back hallway of the diner, her hands smoothing nervously over the simple navy dress she had pulled from the very back of her closet. It wasn't new, it wasn't fancy, but it was clean. And it was hers. She tucked a stray curl behind her ear, studying her reflection, as if trying to find in it the woman William Hartman had seen. Her stomach fluttered with nerves so fierce it almost made her dizzy, but she forced herself to lift her chin and square her shoulders, the way her mama had taught her when she was a little girl facing the world for the first time. When she arrived at the community center where the forum was being held, she nearly turned around and fled. The building was bigger than she had expected, grand in a way that made her worn-out sneakers feel like a crime against the polished floors. People in suits and dresses milled about, name tags clipped neatly to their jackets, laughter and murmurs echoing off the high ceilings. Elise clutched her coat tighter around herself, feeling out of place, small and raw. She was halfway through convincing herself to slip back out the door when she heard his voice. "Miss Johnson." She turned and found William Hartman weaving his way through the crowd toward her, his smile genuine and wide. He was dressed sharply again, but it was the same man she had pulled in from the cold, the same man she had fed stew and pie at her scratched-up counter. He stopped in front of her, studying her with a kind of quiet pride that made her cheeks burn. "You made it," he said simply. "I almost didn't," Elise admitted, tugging self-consciously at her sleeves. "I still don't know what I'm doing here." William's smile didn't falter. He held out his arm, gentlemanlike, and when she hesitated, he leaned in and said, low enough that only she could hear, "You're here because this city needs more people like you, and because sometimes the smallest voices tell the biggest truths." She took his arm then, swallowing hard past the knot in her throat, and let him guide her toward the front of the room, where rows of chairs faced a simple podium. Elise tried not to look at the crowd, tried not to think about the dozens of eyes that would soon turn to her. She kept her focus on the memory of that night in the diner, the man shivering under a worn blanket, the way his hands had trembled around a chipped bowl of stew, the way he had left without a word but come back with the weight of his gratitude stitched into every word he spoke. When it was time, William stepped up to the podium, his voice steady and commanding as he welcomed everyone, spoke of the city's hardships, its resilience, and the importance of compassion stitched into everyday acts. Then he turned slightly, extending a hand toward her. "Today," he said, his voice rich with emotion, "I want you to meet someone who embodies the spirit of this city in ways no title ever could. Someone who reminds us that real change starts with a single act of kindness, done without expectation of reward." Elise felt her legs move before her mind could catch up, her heart thudding so hard she thought surely the entire room could hear it. She took his hand and stepped up beside him, the lights warm on her skin, the murmur of the crowd fading into a soft buzz at the edges of her awareness. William squeezed her fingers briefly, then released her, stepping back to let her stand on her own. She cleared her throat once, twice, the microphone hissing softly as she leaned in. Her voice, when it came, was rough but steady. "I'm not a leader," she said, words simple and unadorned. "I'm not someone who usually stands in front of rooms like this. I'm a waitress. I serve coffee. I wipe down tables. I listen when people need to talk, and sometimes, when there's a little extra, I share what I have." She glanced over the crowd, saw their faces open and waiting, not judging. "I didn't do anything special. I just did what my mama taught me. To see people, really see them, and to help if you can. That's all." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous or overwhelming. It was steady, sincere, the kind that wrapped itself around you and stitched your broken pieces a little tighter together. Elise blinked hard, smiling despite herself, as William stepped forward again. Afterward, as people came up to shake her hand, to thank her, to ask for advice she still didn't feel qualified to give, William stayed close, never once letting her feel alone in the crush of faces and voices. Later, as the crowd thinned and the evening folded itself into a softer, quieter rhythm, William found her by the refreshment table, a cup of lukewarm coffee in her hand. "There's one more thing," he said, his tone casual but his eyes serious. "We're opening a new shelter on the east side, a real one. Showers, beds, job resources, medical care. Not just a place to hide from the cold, but a place to start over. We need someone like you to help run it." Elise nearly dropped her cup. "Me?" she breathed, heart leaping into her throat all over again. "You," William said firmly. "You have the heart for it. The rest, we'll figure out together." For a long, trembling moment, Elise stared at him, at the offer hanging between them like a door just waiting for her to be brave enough to step through. Doubts battered her. She didn't have a fancy degree, she wasn't polished, she wasn't important. But then she remembered that night in the diner, the way she hadn't hesitated, the way she had acted simply because someone needed her to. Slowly, Elise nodded, a smile breaking across her face like the first true sunlight after a long, bitter storm. "All right," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'll do it." William's smile was wide and real, the kind of smile that felt like the start of something new. And as Elise Johnson stood there, the worn-out waitress with the steady hands and the stubborn heart, she realized that sometimes the biggest changes began not with grand speeches or sweeping gestures, but with a bowl of stew, a warm booth, and the simple, radical decision to care. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.